Hello, welcome to Return to Life. Today, we will listen to a story about the cracks in life where people have felt weak, full of doubt, yet kept moving forward. If you are standing between exhaustion and hope, this story may be for you.
It started with something so small, so ordinary, that Ethan didn't think twice about it. Just an itch on the back of his neck, the kind of irritation most people have experienced at some point in their lives. At first it felt like nothing more than a mosquito bite, something minor, something forgettable. He reached back absent-mindedly while sitting at his desk, scratching it lightly with his fingertips without even turning his head to look. It was late in the evening, the house quiet, except for the low hum of an old fan spinning in the corner, pushing warm air around a room that had long stopped feeling fresh. Nothing about the moment seemed unusual, and yet the itch didn't go away. It lingered longer than it should have. Not intense enough to alarm him, but persistent enough to keep pulling his attention back to it. He scratched again, then again, each time expecting the sensation to fade the way it normally would. Instead, it stayed. A dull, steady irritation, almost as if it was sitting just beneath the surface of his skin rather than on it. Ethan shifted slightly in his chair, pressing the back of his neck against the fabric, hoping the pressure might help. For a brief moment, it did. Or at least it seemed to, but within seconds the feeling returned, exactly the same, in exactly the same spot. He didn't think much of it at the time. Life had been stressful enough already. Money was tight, his parents were doing what they could to keep things stable, and small discomforts like this didn't qualify as problems worth worrying about. It was easier to ignore it, to assume it would disappear on its own like every other minor irritation he had experienced before. That's what people do most of the time. If something doesn't hurt enough, if it doesn't disrupt your routine, you convince yourself it isn't important. That night, Ethan went to bed like he always did. The same old mattress, slightly uneven from years of use, supported his weight as he lay down. The sheets were worn but familiar, carrying the faint scent of detergent that never quite masked the age of the fabric. The room felt closed in, the windows shut tight, the air unmoving except for the occasional push from the fan. It was the kind of environment you stop noticing after living in it long enough. As he settled into bed, his hand reached back again, almost automatically, scratching the same spot without thought. The sensation was still there, unchanged, steady, quietly persistent. He let out a small breath, more out of habit than concern, then turned onto his side and closed his eyes. Sleep came the way it usually did, gradually, pulling him under without resistance. And somewhere between drifting off and losing awareness completely, his fingers brushed that spot one more time. He didn't check it, didn't question it, didn't think anything of it. To him, it was still just a bite, something insignificant, something temporary. But what he didn't realize was that this wasn't going to fade overnight. What he thought was simple had already begun to change into something else, something that wouldn't follow the rules he expected, and no matter how much he ignored it, it didn't go away. The next morning, Ethan barely thought about the itch. That was the strange part. For something that had lingered so persistently the night before, it seemed to fade into the background as soon as the day began. He woke up to the familiar sounds of the house, the quiet creak of wood shifting, the soft clatter of dishes in the kitchen, and the faint smell of cheap coffee drifting through the hallway. It was the kind of morning he had lived through hundreds of times before, predictable and uneventful, the kind that makes it easy to ignore anything that doesn't demand immediate attention. Their house wasn't much to look at. It had aged in a way that didn't feel charming, just worn. The paint on the walls had dulled over time, and certain spots carried stains that no one bothered trying to remove anymore. The floor creaked in specific places, the kind you learned to avoid if you didn't want to wake someone in the middle of the night. But despite all of that, it was still home. And when you grow up in a place like that, you don't question its condition, you adjust to it. Ethan sat up slowly in bed, stretching his neck without thinking, and for a brief moment, he felt it again. The itch. Still there, but faint, almost unnoticeable unless he focused on it. He reached back and scratched it once, lightly, then moved on as if it didn't matter, because at that point, it didn't feel like it did. In the kitchen, his mother was already folding clothes at the table, her movements slow but practiced. His father sat nearby with a cup of coffee, staring into it as if trying to solve something that had no clear answer. The routine was familiar, almost comforting in its simplicity, "Morning," Ethan said, his voice still heavy from sleep. His mother looked up and smiled, tired but warm. "Morning. You sleep okay?" "Yeah," he replied, pausing just slightly. "I think so." He didn't mention the itch. It didn't feel important enough to bring into the conversation. In a house like theirs, you learn early on what qualifies as a problem and what doesn't. A small irritation, something that wasn't painful, something that didn't stop you from functioning, that didn't make the list. Breakfast was simple. Toast, eggs, nothing more. They ate mostly in silence, not because anything was wrong, but because that's how it had always been. Outside, the neighborhood looked the same as it always did. Quiet, unchanged, a place where time seemed to move slower than everywhere else. But inside Ethan's room, there were details that hadn't been questioned in years. The mattress he slept on had been there for as long as anyone could remember. It had softened unevenly, dipping in places where weight had pressed down night after night. The seams along the edges had loosened slightly over time, creating tiny folds in the fabric that most people would never think to examine. The sheets were clean enough, but not always freshly washed. Not because they didn't care, but because priorities shift when money and time are limited. Laundry cost money. Time required energy. And both were things the family had to manage carefully. That afternoon, Ethan returned home more tired than usual. Work had drained him in a way that wasn't dramatic, just steady and exhausting. He dropped his bag, sat down on the edge of his bed, and instinctively reached back to scratch his neck again. This time, he paused slightly. The sensation was still there, not stronger, but not gone either. He stood up and walked over to the mirror, turning awkwardly to get a better look. The lighting wasn't great, but he could just make out a small red spot, nothing alarming, nothing that stood out as unusual, just enough to confirm what he already assumed. Yeah, just a bite, he said quietly to himself. And with that, he let it go again. That's the thing most people don't realize. Bedbugs don't need dirt, and they don't need a messy home. They don't care how clean your space is or how often you wash your sheets. All they need is access. Access to a place where someone lies still long enough, often enough, for them to feed without being noticed. And places like Ethan's room, warm, quiet, predictable, offer exactly that. That evening, his mother decided to change the sheets. Not because of anything specific, just because it had been a while. She pulled them off, shook them out lightly, then replaced them with a clean set. The motion was routine, automatic, something she had done countless times before. Nothing seemed out of place. No obvious signs, no visible movement, nothing that would suggest a problem. Because early on, there usually aren't any. That's what makes situations like this so easy to overlook. There's nothing dramatic, nothing that forces you to stop and investigate. Just small signs that are easy to dismiss, especially when you expect them to disappear on their own. When night came again, everything followed the same pattern. Lights went out, the house settled into silence, and Ethan returned to his bed without hesitation. He lay down, adjusted his pillow, and stared at the ceiling for a moment before closing his eyes. For a while, everything felt normal. Then the sensation returned, stronger than it had been that morning. His eyes opened slowly, and his hand moved to the back of his neck again. He scratched, expecting relief, and for a brief second, he got it. But it didn't last. The itch came back almost immediately, sharper this time, harder to ignore. He shifted slightly under the blanket, then paused, because there was another one. Lower, closer to his shoulder. Ethan frowned, reaching down to scratch that spot as well. The same pattern, relief, then return. He sat up slightly, his expression tightening just a bit, not from fear, but from confusion. Okay, that's new. He scratched again, then stopped, as if trying to understand what was happening. The feeling wasn't overwhelming yet, but it was different. Repetitive, unpredictable in a way that didn't quite make sense. Still, exhaustion eventually took over. His body was too tired to stay alert, too worn down to keep questioning it. He lay back down, shifting once more before finally closing his eyes. And within minutes he fell asleep, unaware that this wasn't just a single bite anymore, and whatever had started the night before was quietly becoming something more consistent, more structured, and far more difficult to ignore. By the third day, Ethan couldn't ignore it anymore. What had started as a minor irritation had clearly changed into something else. When he reached back that morning, his fingers didn't just find a small bump. The area had swollen noticeably, larger than before, and when he pressed it, he immediately felt the difference. The skin was warmer, tighter, and more sensitive. Not sharp pain, but a dull, steady discomfort that seemed to sit deeper than the surface. He stood up and walked to the bathroom mirror, turning his neck slowly to get a better view. This time, the redness was obvious. It spread outward in a faint circle, and the center looked slightly raised, almost glossy under the light. When he touched it again, the heat was unmistakable. It wasn't just irritation anymore. It felt like inflammation. "That's not normal," he muttered under his breath. "There's a point where something small stops feeling small. Not because it suddenly becomes dangerous, but because it stops behaving the way you expect it to." Ethan could feel that shift happening, even if he didn't fully understand it yet. The question in his mind was no longer "what is this?" but "why is it getting worse?" In the kitchen, his mother noticed it immediately. "What happened to your neck?" she asked, stepping closer before he even had time to respond. Ethan hesitated, then shrugged. "Probably just a bite. It's been there a couple days." She leaned in slightly, her expression tightening as she looked more closely. "That doesn't look like a normal bite." He tried to brush it off. "It's fine, just itchy." But even as he said it, he could feel the discomfort spreading slightly, like the sensation wasn't as contained as it had been before. His father barely looked up from his coffee. "Put some cream on it." "It'll go away," he said, his tone calm, almost dismissive. In a way, that response made sense. In their household, problems were handled simply. You didn't escalate unless you had to. You didn't assume the worst. You dealt with what was in front of you, so that's exactly what they did. Later that morning, his mother brought out an old tube of topical ointment. It had been sitting in a drawer for years, used occasionally for minor skin issues. "Sit down," she said, and Ethan followed without argument. She applied a thin layer over the swollen area, and for a brief moment, the cooling sensation felt like relief. The tightness eased slightly, and the itch faded just enough to make it seem manageable again. That small improvement was enough to give them confidence. It felt like they were addressing the problem, even if they didn't fully understand it. But what most people don't realize is this: treating the surface doesn't fix the source. That afternoon, they took it a step further. His father brought out a can of insect spray and began treating the room. The sharp chemical smell filled the air as he moved around the bed, the corners, the floor. "Just in case," he said. Ethan stripped the bed again, more thoroughly this time, removing the sheets, pillowcases, everything. They washed them in hot water, running a longer cycle than usual, convinced that whatever was causing this would be eliminated. They were doing what most people would do, taking visible action, addressing what they could see. But the problem wasn't just what they could see. That night, when Ethan lay down again, he expected things to improve. He had done something about it. The room had been treated, the bed cleaned, the swelling covered with ointment. Logically, it should have been better. For a while, it seemed like it might be. Then the feeling returned, stronger than before. His eyes opened slowly in the dark, his hand moving instantly to the back of his neck. The swelling felt larger, tighter, and when he pressed it, a dull throbbing sensation spread outward. He sat up slightly, his breathing heavier now, more aware of his body than he had been the previous nights. And then he noticed something else. He didn't feel right, not just at the surface, not just in the skin, but overall. His body felt heavier, his movements slightly slower. There was a subtle warmth building in his face, and at the same time, a faint chill running through him. It wasn't extreme, but it was enough to make him stop and pay attention. He swung his legs off the bed and stood up, steadying himself for a moment before walking toward the bathroom. The light felt too bright when he turned it on. He leaned closer to the mirror again, focusing on the swelling. It had grown, not dramatically, but clearly. The redness deeper, the edges more defined, and when he touched it this time, the heat was stronger than before. Then he looked at himself more carefully. His face looked slightly flushed, his eyes heavier. He raised his hand to his forehead and paused. Warm. Not normal warmth. Fever. Low but present. That was the moment things shifted again, because a bite doesn't usually cause that. Not like this. In the hallway, his mother heard movement and stepped out of her room. "Ethan?" she called softly. "I think I might be getting sick," he replied. She walked over quickly, placing her hand against his forehead. Her expression changed almost immediately. "You're warm." His father appeared a moment later, drawn by the conversation. "What's going on?" he asked. "He's got a fever," she replied. They stood there for a moment, all looking at the same situation but seeing it differently. This wasn't just an itch anymore. It wasn't just a bite. It had crossed into something else. Still unclear, still manageable maybe, but no longer something they could easily ignore. "Let's just give it another day," his father said finally. Another day. That decision didn't feel as simple as it had before, because now for the first time there was a quiet awareness settling in all of them. Something was wrong, and whatever it wasn't going away. The next morning, Ethan knew immediately that things were getting worse. It wasn't a dramatic realization, not a sudden shock, but a quiet certainty that settled in the moment he woke up. His body felt heavier than usual, like the kind of exhaustion that sleep doesn't fix. As soon as he became aware of himself, the sensation returned. The itch was no longer subtle. It was sharper, more aggressive, demanding attention before he was even fully awake. His hand moved instinctively to the back of his neck, and the moment his fingers touched the swelling, he flinched. The area had changed again. It wasn't just raised anymore. It felt firm, almost dense, as if the skin had tightened around something underneath. When he pressed it lightly, a deeper discomfort spread outward, not just itching now, but aching in a way that felt harder to ignore. He sat up slowly, rolling his shoulders, as if movement might distract him, but it didn't. The sensation was still there, constant and present. And then he noticed something else. It wasn't just his neck anymore. There were other spots. At first, they were easy to dismiss. A faint itch near his collarbone, another along the upper part of his back. Small, subtle, almost unnoticeable unless he focused on them. But once he noticed them, he couldn't unnotice them. He reached down and scratched one, then another, each time expecting the same brief relief. It came, but it didn't last. Within seconds, the itch returned, stronger than before, as if his body was reacting faster than he could respond. He stood up and walked to the mirror again, this time with more urgency. When he looked at his reflection, he paused. The swelling on his neck was clearly larger now, more defined than it had been the night before. The redness had deepened, spreading slightly, and the skin looked tighter, almost stretched. But what caught his attention wasn't just the size. It was the pattern. Around the main swelling, there were smaller marks, faint but visible. Tiny red spots grouped together in a way that didn't feel random, not scattered like typical irritation, but clustered close together as if they had a connection to each other. Ethan leaned closer, narrowing his eyes. "That doesn't make sense," he said quietly, because it didn't. It didn't look like a single bite anymore. It looked like multiple, all concentrated in the same general area. That was the moment a different kind of discomfort settled in, not physical, but mental. Not fear, not yet, but a growing awareness that something about this situation wasn't adding up. In the kitchen, his mother noticed the change immediately. "That got bigger," she said, her tone more serious now. Ethan nodded. "Yeah, and there's more." He turned slightly, showing her the other spots along his shoulder. She stepped closer, examining them carefully, her expression tightening. His father glanced over, less dismissive than before, but still trying to keep things simple. "Some bugs bite more than once," he said, and technically that was true. What most people don't realize is that certain insects don't just bite once and leave, they return. They feed multiple times, often in the same area, especially when the conditions allow it. But Ethan didn't know that yet. All he knew was that his body felt like it was reacting in ways he couldn't control. As the day went on, the itching became harder to manage. It didn't stay constant, but it came in waves, each one stronger than the last. He would be sitting still, doing nothing, and suddenly the sensation would flare up, pulling all of his focus toward it. He tried not to scratch, telling himself it would only make things worse, but resisting it took more effort each time, and every time he gave in, the cycle repeated. Brief relief, followed by stronger irritation. It wasn't just uncomfortable anymore, it was exhausting. By the afternoon, the area on his neck felt tight all the time, even when he wasn't touching it. It had become a constant presence, something he was aware of whether he wanted to be or not. His focus slipped throughout the day, small tasks taking more effort than they should have. Not because he was in severe pain, but because the discomfort never fully stopped. That's how it works. It doesn't overwhelm you all at once. It wears you down slowly, quietly, until you realize you haven't felt normal for hours. That evening, when Ethan returned to his room, he hesitated for a brief moment before sitting on the bed. It was subtle, almost unnoticeable, but it was there. Because now, that space was no longer neutral. It was connected to what he was feeling. The itch, the discomfort, the confusion. Still, he sat down. The mattress dipped beneath him the same way it always had, familiar and unchanged. But as he leaned back slightly, his hand moved again, almost automatically. scratching the same spot, then another, then another. This time, he didn't stop right away. Because now, the itch wasn't something he could casually ignore, it was something that kept returning. Something persistent. Something that didn't just happen once, but kept happening again and again. And for the first time, it felt like he wasn't in control of it anymore. That night, Ethan didn't sleep properly. He lay in bed with his eyes closed, his body still, but his mind never fully let go. Every time he drifted close to sleep, something pulled him back. The sensation had changed again. It was no longer occasional. It came in waves, stronger and more frequent, as if his body was reacting repeatedly to something that kept happening. At first, it was the same spot on his neck, tight and swollen, pulsing faintly beneath the skin. But then the feeling spread. A sharp itch appeared along his shoulder, followed by another near his upper arm, then one lower along his back. Each one demanded attention, each one pulling him out of any chance of rest. He shifted under the blanket, trying to ignore it. He told himself to stay still, to stop reacting, to let it pass. But the problem was, it didn't pass. It built. The longer he resisted, the more intense it felt, until finally his hand moved on its own, scratching one spot, then another, chasing a relief that never lasted. Every time he scratched, the cycle repeated. A brief moment, where the irritation eased, followed almost immediately by a stronger return. It felt like his body was responding faster than he could keep up with, like the reaction was no longer under his control. He turned onto his side, then onto his back, then the other side again. The mattress creaked softly beneath him, the sound louder in the stillness of the room. The air felt heavy, almost trapped, pressing against his skin. Minutes passed, then longer. Time stretched in a way that made it hard to measure. He wasn't fully awake, but he wasn't asleep either. At some point, he sat up, frustrated, exhausted, his movements sharper now. His hand moved quickly across his neck, then his shoulder, then down his arm. The scratching was no longer casual, it was urgent, each movement faster, more deliberate, trying to get ahead of the sensation before it intensified again. "Why is this happening?" he muttered, his voice low, dry from the lack of rest. There was no answer, only the continued cycle. Across the hall, his mother heard the movement, the shifting of the bed, the uneven rhythm of someone who wasn't sleeping. She stepped into the hallway and called softly, "Ethan, I'm awake," he replied. She entered the room and turned on a dim light, just enough to see him clearly. For a moment she didn't speak, she simply observed. The way he was sitting, the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand kept returning to his skin without him even realizing it. "You didn't sleep, did you?" she asked. Ethan shook his head slightly. "It's worse at night." That detail mattered, because patterns matter. She stepped closer. "Let me see." He turned slightly, and this time there was no need to look closely. The marks were visible immediately, more than before. Some raised, some just beginning to form, but clearly increasing in number. Her expression shifted from concern to something more serious. "This isn't just one bite," she said. "I know. Does it hurt?" Ethan paused for a second before answering. "Yeah, it does." It wasn't just pain. It was the combination of itch, pressure, and constant irritation that made it harder to tolerate. His father appeared in the doorway a moment later, drawn by the voices. He looked at Ethan, then at the marks, and this time he didn't dismiss it as quickly. "That's a lot," he admitted. The room fell quiet for a moment, because now all of them were seeing the same thing. This wasn't random, this wasn't improving, and it definitely wasn't going away. "Maybe it's an allergic reaction," his mother said, trying to make sense of it. That explanation made sense on the surface. Different people react differently to the same trigger. Some barely notice insect bites, while others develop swelling, redness, even fever. It was possible that Ethan's body was simply reacting more aggressively than usual, but even that explanation had limits. Because an allergic reaction doesn't explain repetition, it doesn't explain why new marks kept appearing. And it doesn't explain why it was happening mostly at night. Still, it gave them something to hold on to, something that felt manageable. Ethan leaned back slightly, exhausted, his eyes burning from lack of sleep. His body felt drained, not just from the physical discomfort, but from the constant interruption. Sleep wasn't just reduced, it was broken, fragmented, never deep enough to recover. His mother turned off the light, leaving the room dim again. "Try to rest," she said softly. Ethan lay back down, closed his eyes, waited. For a moment nothing happened. Then slowly, the sensation returned, not immediately overwhelming, but steady, waiting. And as the minutes passed, one thing became clear. This wasn't just discomfort anymore. It was a pattern, something that happened when he was still, when he was quiet, when he was most vulnerable, and even without understanding it yet. His body had already started to recognize it. Night wasn't rest anymore. Night was when it happened. By the next morning, the tension in the house was no longer subtle. It wasn't loud, there were no raised voices, but something had shifted in the way everyone moved, the way they spoke, the way they looked at Ethan. The problem was no longer just his. It had spread into the space around him. Ethan sat at the table, barely touching his food. The itch hadn't stopped, and neither had the discomfort. Even when it wasn't at its worst, it was always there, sitting just beneath the surface, waiting to flare up again. His movements were slower now, not because he wanted them to be, but because everything required more effort than it should have. His mother noticed immediately. She had been watching him closely since the night before, and now she didn't even try to hide it. "You didn't sleep again, did you?" she asked. Ethan shook his head slightly. "Not really." That was enough for her. She glanced at his neck, then at his arms, where the marks had become more visible. They were no longer something you had to look for. They were there, clear and spreading, impossible to dismiss as a single issue. "We need to do something," she said, her voice low but firm. His father leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "We are doing something." "No," she replied, sharper this time. "We're guessing." The word landed heavily. Because it was true. Everything they had done so far, cream, cleaning, spraying, none of it was based on certainty. It was reaction without understanding, trying things and hoping one of them worked. Ethan stayed quiet, staring down at his plate. He didn't have the energy to take sides, and more importantly, he didn't have answers. His body was already dealing with enough. His father rubbed his forehead. "It's probably still bites. Maybe fleas, maybe something in the house. It happens. Then why is it getting worse?" she asked. There was no immediate response, because there wasn't a simple explanation. That's the part people struggle with the most. When something doesn't follow the expected pattern, when it doesn't improve after you've done what normally works, it creates a kind of pressure, not just physically, but mentally. His mother stood up, pacing slightly, her arms crossing tightly. "We should take him to a doctor." That suggestion changed the tone of the room instantly, because in their household, that wasn't a casual decision. It meant time off work. It meant money. It meant admitting that the situation might be more serious than they wanted to believe. His father hesitated, not out of indifference, but calculation. You could see it in the way he paused, weighing options, measuring consequences. "It's not that bad yet," he said finally. Ethan looked up at that, not with anger, not even with surprise, just a quiet kind of exhaustion, because part of him understood exactly what his father meant, and another part of him knew that things were already past the point of being not that bad. That's where he was stuck, between two realities, one where this was still manageable, and one where it clearly wasn't. His mother turned toward him again. "Ethan, tell me honestly, is it getting worse?" He hesitated, just for a moment, but long enough. Yeah, that single word shifted everything, because now it wasn't just visible, it was confirmed. And once something is acknowledged out loud, it becomes harder to ignore. Still, no one moved right away. No one made a final decision, because that's how it works in situations like this. Decisions don't happen instantly. They build slowly, through doubt, through hesitation, through the quiet hope that things might still resolve on their own. Later that afternoon, Ethan went back to his room, not to rest, not to sleep, but to get away from the conversation, from the tension, from the weight of being the center of something no one fully understood. He sat on the edge of the bed, staring at nothing in particular. His hand lifted slightly toward his neck, then stopped midway. He didn't want to touch it, not because it hurt too much, but because touching it made it real in a way he didn't want to deal with. The room felt different now. Nothing had physically changed. The same walls, the same bed, the same air. But his perception of it had. Every corner felt questionable. Every surface felt like it might be connected. That's what uncertainty does. It changes how you see familiar things. He looked down at the mattress, at the seams along the edges, at the folds in the fabric that had always been there. For the first time, he didn't just see a place to sleep. He saw a possibility, a question he hadn't asked before, but he still didn't act on it. Not yet, because even now, he didn't fully understand what he was looking for. The door creaked slightly behind him. His mother stepped in quietly. "I called the clinic," she said. Ethan looked up. "They said we can come in tomorrow." There was a hint of relief in her voice, but it was mixed with something else. Concern, the kind that doesn't go away just because you've made a decision. Ethan nodded slowly. Okay. That should have felt like progress, like control. But instead, it felt like something else, like crossing a line. Because once you involve someone else, once you seek help, you're admitting something you can't take back. This isn't normal. This isn't under control. And as Ethan leaned back slightly, trying to find a position that didn't irritate his skin, the sensation returned again. Stronger, deeper, more persistent than before. His jaw tightened, his hand gripping the edge of the bed as he resisted the urge to scratch. And for a moment, he just sat there, not moving, not reacting, just feeling it. That steady, growing discomfort that no longer felt random. Something was wrong, not just with his body, but with the situation itself, and whatever was causing it was still there. The next morning, for the first time in days, Ethan felt something close to relief. It wasn't a full recovery, not even close, but it was enough to notice. The fever had gone down, the heaviness in his body had eased, and the constant pressure in his neck didn't feel as intense as it had the night before. When he sat up and reached back to touch the swollen area, he paused. It was still there, still firm, but less painful. That small difference changed everything. He stood up, moving more easily than he had the previous day, and for a moment, he allowed himself to believe that things might finally be improving. In the kitchen, his mother noticed it too. "You look better," she said, studying his face carefully. "I feel better," Ethan replied, and this time, he meant it. Even his father seemed relieved. He nodded slightly, as if this confirmed what he had believed all along. "Body just needed time," he said. "Happens all the time." And just like that, the situation felt manageable again. The urgency faded. The concern softened. Even the idea of going to the clinic no longer felt immediate. "Let's just keep watching it," his father added. No one argued. Because improvement, even a small amount, gives people permission to relax. It creates the impression that the problem is resolving itself, that whatever was happening is already on its way out. That day passed more normally than the ones before it. Ethan moved around without constantly thinking about the itch. It was still there, but quieter, less aggressive, easier to ignore. He even spent time in his room without that same level of tension, without the constant awareness that something was wrong. And that was the mistake. Because when a problem seems to fade, you stop looking for the cause. That night, Ethan went to bed with a different mindset. He wasn't as tense. His body wasn't on edge. When he lay down, he adjusted his pillow, stretched slightly, and for the first time in days, he felt himself relax. Sleep came faster, deeper, more complete. For a while, everything felt normal again, but sometime in the middle of the night, it came back, not slowly, not in waves, all at once. Ethan's eyes snapped open, his hand moving instantly to his neck. The pressure had returned, stronger than before. Not just an itch anymore, but tight, swollen, almost throbbing beneath the skin. He sat up quickly, his breathing heavier now as the sensation spread. And it wasn't just his neck, his shoulder, his back, multiple points, all at the same time, as if his body had been quiet only long enough to react harder, faster, more aggressively. He stood up and turned on the light, his movements sharper now, more urgent. When he looked in the mirror, the difference was immediate. The swelling hadn't just returned, it had expanded. The redness was deeper, the edges more defined, and the surrounding skin looked more irritated than ever. This wasn't a setback, it was escalation. The improvement from earlier that day hadn't been recovery, it had been a pause, and now whatever was causing this was pushing back harder than before. That night, Ethan didn't even try to convince himself it would get better. The pattern was already clear. Whatever was happening wasn't random, and it wasn't stopping. When he lay down, his body stayed tense, as if it had already learned what to expect. The room was quiet, the same as every night before, but the silence didn't feel calm anymore. It felt like waiting. At first, nothing happened. A few minutes passed, then longer. His breathing slowly settled, his body beginning to relax despite everything. For a brief moment, it almost felt like the earlier improvement might return. Like maybe the worst had already passed, then the sensation came back, not as an itch, as pressure. It started at the back of his neck, the same place as before, but this time it felt different immediately. Deeper, more concentrated. As if something beneath the skin was pushing outward instead of just irritating the surface. Ethan's eyes opened slowly, his hand moving instinctively toward the spot, but he didn't scratch. He pressed, gently at first. And then he stopped. Because the sensation didn't react the way it used to. It didn't shift, it didn't spread, it pushed back. Ethan sat up slowly, his breathing more controlled now, his awareness sharper than it had been at any point before. He pressed again, more carefully this time, focusing on what he was feeling instead of reacting to it. The swelling had changed. It wasn't soft anymore. It felt firm, contained, like the skin had tightened around something inside. That thought stayed with him longer than it should have. Something inside. He stood up and walked to the mirror, turning on the light without hesitation. There was no point avoiding it now. When he looked at the swelling, the difference was obvious. It was raised higher than before. The skin stretched tight across it, slightly discolored, deeper than simple redness. It looked inflamed from within, not just irritated on the surface. He leaned closer, adjusting his angle, studying it more carefully than he had before. And then he noticed it. At the center of the swelling, there was a small, darker point. It wasn't large, and it wasn't obvious unless you were looking for it, but once he saw it, he couldn't unsee it. It wasn't just a random discoloration. It looked defined, deliberate. Ethan raised his hand again, hesitating for a moment before pressing just beside that point. The reaction was immediate. A sharp, localized pain, not overwhelming but precise, like he had found the exact center of whatever was causing it. He pulled his hand back slightly, his heart rate picking up, not from panic but from realization. This wasn't just swelling. There was structure to it, a center, a source. He stared at his reflection, trying to make sense of it, trying to match what he was seeing with anything familiar. But nothing fit. It didn't behave like a normal bite. It didn't feel like a rash or irritation. It felt contained, like something had formed beneath the skin. He reached up again, slower this time, more deliberate. Instead of pressing directly on the center, he pressed around it, testing the edges. Each time the same result. Pressure, resistance. That same contained feeling, like whatever was there wasn't spreading, but staying in place. That's when the thought became clearer. Not fully logical, but strong enough. What if this wasn't just a reaction? What if something was actually there? He lowered his hand slowly, stepping back from the mirror. For a moment, he didn't move. His mind was catching up, trying to process the possibility. Because if that was true, then everything about the past few days changed. The bites, the pattern, the timing. The way it got worse at night, none of it was random. Ethan glanced toward the bed behind him. It looked exactly the same as it always had. Nothing visibly wrong, nothing obvious. But now, it didn't feel neutral anymore. It felt connected. That was the part that unsettled him the most. Not the discomfort, not even the swelling, but the realization that whatever caused this might not be coming from his body. It might be coming from his environment. He turned back to the mirror one more time, his eyes locking onto that small dark center again. It was subtle, but it was real. And now that he had seen it, he couldn't ignore it. His breathing slowed, more controlled now, more focused. Because this wasn't something he could wait out anymore. This wasn't something that would just disappear. Whatever was causing this had progressed step by step, night after night. And now it had reached a point where it wasn't just discomfort. It was defined, contained, real. Ethan straightened slightly, his expression shifting. Not fear, not panic, but something more grounded. Decision. Because for the first time since this started, he wasn't just reacting anymore. He was thinking. And the next step wasn't to ignore it. It was to find out exactly what it was. Ethan didn't go back to bed after that. He stayed standing in front of the mirror for a long moment, staring at the swelling, at that small dark point in the center, letting the realization settle in. The discomfort was still there, but it wasn't the main focus anymore. What mattered now was understanding what he was dealing with. Because this didn't feel like something he could wait out. It felt like something that needed to be dealt with. The house was still quiet. His parents hadn't woken up yet, and for once that worked in his favor. No questions, no interruptions, no hesitation from anyone else. Just him and the situation in front of him. He turned slightly, examining the spot one more time under the light. The swelling hadn't gone down. If anything, it looked more defined now that he knew what to look for. That small dark point was still there, subtle but unmistakable. Ethan exhaled slowly and reached for the drawer beneath the sink. Inside were basic things. Nothing medical, nothing specialized. Just everyday items people keep without thinking much about them. He hesitated for a moment, not because he didn't know what he was about to do, but because he understood that once he did it, there was no going back to pretending this was something simple. He picked something small, something precise enough, not to cut, just to apply pressure. He leaned closer to the mirror again, steadying himself with one hand against the counter. His other hand moved slowly toward the swelling. His breathing was controlled now, focused, every movement deliberate. He pressed gently at first. Nothing happened, just the same pressure pushing back. He adjusted slightly and pressed again, this time a little firmer, just around the center, not directly on it. The skin resisted, tight, unyielding. He paused, then tried again from a slightly different angle, applying a bit more force. And then, something changed. It wasn't visible at first, but he felt it, a slight shift beneath the surface, like pressure releasing just enough to notice. Ethan froze for a second, then leaned in closer. He pressed again, more carefully now, repeating the same motion. And this time, there was a response, a sharp, localized sting, followed by a subtle release of tension in the swelling. He inhaled sharply, pulling his hand back for just a moment, then immediately leaned forward again, his eyes locked on the mirror, watching, waiting, because now something was happening, and slowly at the surface of the skin, something appeared. Not fluid, not what he expected, something small, dark, barely visible at first, but clearly there. Ethan's breathing slowed as his focus narrowed completely onto that point. "What is that?" he whispered. He raised his hand again, more controlled now, and instead of pressing, he guided gently around the area, allowing whatever was there to come forward. And with one careful movement, it came free, small, solid, no bigger than a grain of rice, dark brown, almost black. Ethan didn't move. He just stood there, staring at it, trying to process what he was seeing. Because it didn't make sense. It wasn't part of his body, that much was obvious. But it had been inside it, embedded, causing everything that had happened over the past few days. He brought it closer to his eyes, examining it more carefully. The shape wasn't random. It had structure, edges, a slight curve. It didn't look like debris. It didn't look accidental. It looked like something designed for a purpose. And that's when something in his memory clicked. Not a clear image, not a full explanation, but a recognition. Something small, sharp, used to break skin, used to feed. Ethan's expression changed slightly, not into panic, but into realization. No way. He stepped back slowly, his mind catching up all at once. The bites, the pattern, the fact that it got worse at night, the clusters, everything aligned, not perfectly, but enough. He turned back to the mirror, looking at the swelling again. It had already started to reduce slightly now that the pressure was gone. The tightness wasn't as intense, but the skin was still irritated, still inflamed. Then he looked back at the object in his hand, and the thought became clear. This hadn't come from him. It had come from something else, something external, something that had access to him while he slept. That's when everything changed, because now, this wasn't just about a reaction. It wasn't just about his body overreacting to bites. There had been something physical inside the wound, something left behind. And if that had happened once, it could happen again. Not just to him, to anyone in that house. Ethan's grip tightened slightly as he looked down at it one last time. The problem wasn't the swelling, it wasn't the itch, it wasn't even the pain. The problem was the source. And now, for the first time, he wasn't guessing anymore. He was looking at proof, and that meant one thing. Whatever had caused this was still there. Ethan didn't say anything right away. He stood there in the bathroom, staring at the small object in his hand, his mind trying to connect what he was seeing with everything that had happened over the past few days. The pressure in his neck had already started to ease slightly, but that wasn't what mattered anymore. What mattered was understanding what this thing actually was, and more importantly, where it came from. He walked out of the bathroom slowly, the house still quiet, and went straight to his room. For the first time since this started, he didn't sit on the bed right away. Instead, he stood there, looking at it differently. Not as a place to rest, but as a possible source. When his parents woke up later that morning, they noticed something had changed in him. It wasn't just the way he moved, but the way he looked at things, more focused, more certain. "What happened?" his mother asked when she saw him holding something between his fingers. Ethan didn't answer immediately. He walked over and placed it carefully on the table. "I think this came out of my neck." Both of them leaned in. His mother's expression tightened. His father's posture shifted, more attentive than before. "What is it?" his father asked. Ethan shook his head slightly. "I don't know, but it wasn't supposed to be there." That statement changed the conversation instantly, because now this wasn't just about irritation or reaction. This was something physical, something real. His father picked it up carefully, turning it slightly under the light. It was small, dark, and rigid, with a shape that didn't look random. "I've seen something like this before," he said slowly. "Where?" his mother asked. He hesitated, thinking. Old apartments, places that had problems. That was the first real clue, not a full answer, but enough to point them in a direction. Ethan's mother frowned. "You mean bugs?" His father didn't answer right away, but he didn't deny it either. That silence was enough, because once the idea enters the room, it changes everything. They went back into Ethan's bedroom together. This time, they didn't just look, they inspected. The mattress, the seams, the edges where fabric met structure. At first, nothing stood out, and that's exactly why situations like this go unnoticed for so long. Bedbugs don't make themselves obvious. They don't live out in the open. They stay hidden, in seams, in folds, in places you don't normally check, because they don't need much. They don't need dirt, they don't need clutter. They just need access. Access to a person who lies still long enough, often enough, for them to feed. Ethan's room had all of that. Old mattress, worn seams, consistent routine, perfect conditions. His mother pulled back the sheet more carefully this time, exposing the edges of the mattress. She leaned closer, her eyes scanning along the stitching. And then she saw it. "Wait." Her voice dropped slightly. She pointed to a small area near the corner. Tiny dark specks, barely noticeable, easy to miss if you weren't looking for them. But now that they were looking, they were there. "What is that?" Ethan asked. His father leaned in, his expression tightening. "That's not dirt," he said, because it wasn't. It was evidence. Bed bugs, scientifically known as Cimex lectularius, are small parasitic insects that feed on blood, usually at night. They don't jump, they don't fly, and they don't need a dirty environment to survive. All they need is proximity to a host and a place to hide during the day. That's what makes them so difficult to detect early. They come out when you're asleep, when your body is still, when you're least aware. Their bites often don't hurt immediately, which is why most people don't react right away. By the time the body starts to respond, itching, swelling, inflammation, the exposure has already happened, and in some cases, like Ethan's, the body reacts more aggressively. Not because the situation is different, but because the immune system responds differently. That's why his marks were worse, why his swelling was more intense, why he developed a fever while others might not. "Check your arms," his mother said suddenly, turning to his father. He looked down, rolling up his sleeve slightly. There were marks, faint, much less severe. But there. That was the moment everything became clear. This wasn't just happening to Ethan, it was happening in the house. He just happened to be reacting more strongly. That realization shifted the focus again, because now the problem wasn't isolated, it was environmental. Where would they come from? Ethan asked. His father leaned back slightly, thinking. Could be anything. Old furniture, clothes, someone brought them in without knowing. That's how it usually happens. Bed bugs don't appear out of nowhere. They travel, in luggage, in secondhand furniture, in clothing, sometimes even on visitors. And once they're inside, they spread quietly, without being noticed, until something like this happens. Ethan looked back at the bed, then at the mattress seams again. Everything made sense now. The timing, the pattern, the fact that it got worse at night, the clusters of bites. It wasn't random, it was consistent, and it had been happening longer than he realized. "What do we do?" his mother asked. That question mattered now, because this wasn't something that would go away on its own. His father exhaled slowly. "We deal with it properly." For the first time since this started, there was no hesitation in his voice, because now they understood the source. And once you understand the source, you can finally address the problem. Ethan went back to the bathroom later that day, where his mother carefully cleaned the area on his neck. Without the pressure from before, the swelling had already begun to reduce slightly, but the skin was still irritated. They treated it properly this time, not just covering it, but addressing the infection risk. Because another thing people don't realize is this. The bites themselves aren't always the biggest problem. It's what happens after. Scratching, bacteria, Secondary infection. That's what had caused the deeper reaction in Ethan's case. He sat there quietly as she finished, his mind still processing everything. This had started as something small, something easy to ignore, something he didn't think twice about. And now, it had revealed something much bigger, not just about his body, but about his environment, about what had been there all along, without anyone noticing. Once they understood what they were dealing with, everything shifted from confusion to action. There was no more guessing, no more waiting to see if things would improve on their own. This was something that had to be handled directly, and handled properly. That same day, the house no longer felt like a place of rest. It became a place of work. Ethan's father started with the bed. The mattress was stripped completely, every layer removed, every seam exposed. This time, they weren't just changing sheets. They were inspecting every inch. The small, dark specks they had seen earlier became easier to recognize once they knew what they were looking for. Tiny signs that had always been there, unnoticed, dismissed, or simply overlooked. His mother gathered all the bedding, not just from Ethan's room, but from the entire house. Everything went into the wash. Hot water, long cycles, repeated loads. It wasn't about routine anymore. It was about elimination. Heat matters. That's one of the most important things people don't realize. Bedbugs don't respond to casual cleaning. They don't disappear with surface-level effort. But high heat, washing, drying, can break the cycle. Ethan vacuumed the room carefully, slower than he had ever cleaned anything before. Not just the floor, but the edges, the corners, the base of the bed, the areas where the mattress met the frame, places no one normally pays attention to because that's where they hide. During the day, they don't move. They stay out of sight, waiting. That realization stayed with Ethan the entire time he worked. The idea that this had been happening while he slept, that something had been close to him night after night without him knowing. It wasn't panic that he felt. It was something quieter, a kind of awareness that doesn't go away once it settles in. They sealed what they could, cleaned what they could, and made decisions about what couldn't be saved. The mattress, worn and already aged, was no longer something they could trust. It wasn't an easy decision, especially given their situation, but it was necessary, because once something becomes a source, you can't keep it. Over the next few days, the house slowly changed, not in appearance, but in behavior. They checked things more carefully, paid attention to details they had ignored before. The routine shifted from passive living to active awareness. Ethan's condition improved as well. Without continued exposure, his body finally had the chance to recover. The swelling on his neck reduced gradually, the redness fading, the pressure disappearing completely. The other marks followed the same pattern, healing slowly, leaving behind only faint reminders of what had happened. The itching stopped. The nights became quiet again. Sleep returned. But it wasn't the same kind of sleep as before. Because once you've experienced something like that, you don't go back to complete unawareness. You notice things differently. You pay attention to your environment in a way you didn't before. A week later, Ethan sat on the edge of his new bed, the room cleaner, more open than it had been before. The air felt different, not because anything dramatic had changed, but because the uncertainty was gone. His mother stood in the doorway, watching him for a moment. "How do you feel?" she asked. Ethan nodded slightly. "Better," and this time there was no hesitation in his voice, because he meant it, not just physically, but mentally. He had gone from not understanding anything about what was happening to recognizing it, confronting it, and resolving it. And that process had changed the way he saw things. His father leaned against the wall nearby. "Sometimes it's not about how big the problem looks," he said. "It's about whether you understand it." Ethan didn't respond right away, but he understood what that meant. Because this had never looked like a big problem at the beginning. It had started as something small, an itch, easy to ignore, easy to dismiss. And that was exactly why it had been allowed to grow. That's how situations like this happen. Not because people don't care, but because they don't recognize what they're dealing with early enough. Ethan leaned back slightly, his hand resting against the back of his neck, not out of habit anymore, but as a quiet reminder of where it had all started. The skin was smooth now, healed, but the memory was still there, and maybe that was the most important part. Because the real danger isn't always the thing that hurts you immediately. It's the thing you don't understand, the thing you overlook, the thing you assume will go away on its own. Ethan glanced once more around the room, then toward the bed, then back toward the doorway where his parents stood. Everything looked normal again. But now he knew better. Sometimes, The smallest signs are the ones that matter most, and sometimes, the real danger isn't what hurts you, it's what you don't understand.
Thank you for staying until the end with Return to Life. If you found a sense of connection or a small spark of hope, carry it with you as you return to everyday life. We look forward to seeing you in the stories ahead.